Okay, let's unpack this. Nearly a billion firearm records reportedly in the hands of the ATF.
A billion.
Think about that number for a second.
For sure.
It's massive.
It really is.
And it immediately raises a fundamental question for me. Is this just about the necessary, if maybe overwhelming, task of keeping track, or is there something else at play when we see numbers like that?
That's the exact question, isn't it? It's right at the heart of our discussion today. We're diving deep into the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, and its ongoing digitization. Specifically, firearm sales records from out-of-business dealers.
Right.
We'll be looking at government reports, legal statutes, trying to really get to the core of this.
The mission today is what? To get past the headlines.
Exactly. Understand the facts, the legal arguments underneath it all, and, well, what this increasing digital footprint might actually mean for everyone.
Right, because you've got these two really distinct viewpoints, don't you? On one side, there's the argument that this is simply bringing outdated record-keeping into the 21st century.
Making it faster for law enforcement, tracing guns used in crimes within the law, they'd say.
But then you have the other side, the very real concerns about privacy, the fear that this could become, a de facto national gun registry, and what that means for Second Amendment rights.
Yeah, those are serious concerns.
So to really get a handle on where we are now, it seems crucial to understand how the ATF even got to this point.
Absolutely.
What's the history there? How did the agency start?
That's a great place to start. And it's fascinating because the ATF's original purpose was, well, quite different from its current focus on firearms. It actually goes all the way back to the late 18th century. The government was primarily concerned with collecting taxes.
Taxes on what?
On imported spirits, actually, to help pay off debts from the Revolutionary War. Then, jump forward to 1862, the Office of Internal Revenue was established within the Treasury Department.
Still Treasury.
Yep. Managing taxes on both alcohol and tobacco. So initially, very much about revenue collection.
So purely about finances in the beginning. When did firearms enter the picture?
Yeah.
Become part of their responsibilities?
That was more gradual. It unfolded over time, During Prohibition in the 1920s, the Prohibition Unit was formed. That later became a bureau.
Oh.
Once Prohibition ended in 1933, the Alcohol Tax Unit, or ATU, was created within the Bureau of Internal Revenue.
Still focused on alcohol taxes then?
Mostly, but its responsibilities expanded. It started including firearms and tobacco. By 1942, a specific unit within the ATU began collecting fees under the National Firearms Act and the Federal Firearms Act. The ATU handled enforcement.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually, it was renamed the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division, or ATTD.
Got it. So a slow but steady broadening of their scope. And when did it officially become the ATF as we, recognize it today?
The Gun Control Act of 1968. That was a real turning point.
How so?
The ATTD's lab took on responsibility for explosives, and the division was then renamed the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the IRS.
Part of the IRS still.
Then, yes. But in 1972, it finally became its own bureau within the Treasury Department. Responsibilities kept expanding arson investigations, enforcing laws on wagering.
Wow, so quite a bit more than just alcohol, tobacco, and firearms.
Yeah, it was involved in quite a lot.
It sounds like an agency initially focused on tax revenue gradually evolved into one with a much broader law enforcement mission.
That's a good way to put it.
Does this historical shift itself suggest any inherent tensions? Or maybe potential for mission creep in how we view the ATF today?
That's a very insightful question. I mean, the evolution definitely highlights how government agencies can adapt, take on new roles in response to changes in society, new laws.
Right.
And that evolution is certainly part of the backdrop for the current debates about the ATF's authority, its scope.
Makes sense.
It's a long way from taxing whiskey to managing, well, nearly 1 billion firearm records.
Absolutely. Now, after 9/11, there were further significant changes, right?
Yes, big ones. The Homeland Security Act of 2002, which kicked in 2003, led to a significant restructuring.
Right.
The ATF's law enforcement functions, they were moved over to the Department of Justice.
Out of Treasury.
Right, while its tax and regulatory roles for alcohol and tobacco stayed within Treasury under a new entity, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB.
So separating enforcement from the tax and regulation side for alcohol and tobacco.
Exactly, a clear division there.
So what would you say is the ATF's core mission now after that restructuring?
Today, their primary focus is really on preventing violent crime involving firearms and explosives, investigating illegal trafficking of alcohol and tobacco products, and regulating the firearms and explosives industries.
Got it.
Of course, it's also important to acknowledge the ATF has faced its share of controversies. Things like Fast and Furious, the gun walking scandal,
Right, I remember that.
and just ongoing criticism from gun rights advocates about how they interpret and enforce regulations.
Okay, a complex history indeed. Now let's delve into the specifics of firearm tracing. Our source material highlights this is a key legal requirement for them.
Yes, absolutely. The Gun Control Act of 1968 mandates that the ATF trace firearms used in crimes.
Why is that so important?
Well, it's a crucial tool for law enforcement, helps identify potential suspects, understand how illegal firearms are moving. When a gun's found at a crime scene, local or state police can request a trace from the ATF's National Tracing Center, the NTC.
And what do they need to provide for that trace?
They need specific info about the firearm, manufacturer, model, caliber, and most importantly, the serial number.
Okay. And how does the NTC actually do the tracing? What kind of systems are involved?
Well, according to a 2016 GAO report, which our sources mention, the NTC relies on several key systems. One of the biggest is OBRIS,
OBRIS.
Out of Business Records Imaging System. It contains digitized records over 285 million back in 2016, probably way more now from firearm dealers who've gone out of business.
Digitized, okay?
Yeah.
But here's the crucial part I read about.
Yes, it's absolutely critical to understand this. Due to legal restrictions, these records are scanned and digitized, but they are not searchable by the purchaser's name.
Not searchable by name. Wait, if the goal is to trace a gun back to a person, how effective can a system not searchable by name truly be? Doesn't that sort of limit its usefulness?
It definitely presents a challenge to efficiency, a big one.
So how do they search it then?
The process for OBRIS involves manually using the federal firearm license number, the FFL number of the defunct dealer, plus the approximate date of the sale and a description of the firearm. They're trying to locate the relevant paper record that got scanned.
Wow, sounds labor-intensive.
It can be very labor-intensive, time-consuming. Besides OBRIS, the NTC also used Access 2000, or A2K. That allowed participating active dealers to electronically upload their disposition records.
Okay, active dealers, that's different.
Right. There was also the Firearm Recovery Notification Program, FRNP, with data on guns suspected in crimes, though the GAO found issues with its centralization before. And finally, the Multiple Sales, or MS, system. That tracked multiple handgun and certain rifle sales. But again, the GAO found inconsistencies in the data maintenance there too.
So it sounds like a patchwork of systems. Some digital, sure, but still a heavy reliance on manual work, especially for those closed dealerships.
That's a fair description.
What happens if those initial automated searches, say in A2K or those other systems, don't turn up a match?
If those fail, the NTC analyst then has to try and trace the firearm through the supply chain.
How did that work?
It involves contacting the original manufacturer or importer, find out where the gun was first distributed. From there, they might need to contact wholesalers, distributors.
Following a chain.
Exactly. Until the trail leads to the individual retailers, the FFLs, who should have the record of the actual sale to the consumer.
And that's where the records of out-of-business FFLs and the Overreach system become so critical, right?
Precisely. If any FFL in that chain has gone out of business, the NTC has to rely on those scanned records in Overreach.
Using that manual search method we talked about.
Right. Using limited info. Our source paper notes that back in fiscal year 2015, the average trace time was somewhere between 4 and 7 business days.
Okay.
But urgent requests, homicides, officer shootings, they get prioritized, often completed much faster, sometimes within 24 hours.
So a sometimes slow, complex process, particularly when older records from defunct dealers are involved. Now let's pivot a bit. Let's talk about some of these ATF forms, policies, recent updates. Form 4473 seems absolutely central to this whole thing. What exactly is it?
It really is central. ATF Form 4473 is the firearms transaction record. Every licensed firearms dealer, every FFL, is legally required to fill one out whenever they sell or transfer a gun to someone who isn't also a licensed dealer, a non-licensee.
And what information does it capture?
It's pretty comprehensive. Detailed info about the firearm itself, make, model, serial number, and detailed personal info about the buyer name, address, date of birth, race, ethnicity. It's the information needed for the background check.
Okay, and the rules around this form seem to be changing. with electronic versions and storage coming in.
Yeah. Yes, important developments there. Back in 2016, an ATF ruling first authorized FFLs to use an electronic version of the 4473.
E-forms.
Right. But it came with specific conditions, to ensure data integrity, accessibility. More recently, in August 2022, another ruling, 2022-01, significantly expanded options for electronic storage.
Oh, so.
This ruling allows dealers to store both forms completed digitally and paper forms they've scanned electronically.
Okay, so more flexibility.
More flexibility, yes, but again, subject to specific requirements. They have to notify the ATF, ensure the records are unalterable, have proper backups, give the ATF continuous access.
Continuous access.
Uninterrupted access, yes. And crucially, they have to transfer those electronic records to the ATF's out-of-business records center if the dealer closes down.
Ah, there's that out-of-business center again.
Exactly. This 2022 ruling basically replaced and broadened earlier, more limited permissions for electronic storage.
So we're seeing a clear trend toward the ATF embracing digital record keeping for these forms held by currently operating dealers. What about the records of dealers who shut down? Our source material mentions expanded retention requirements there.
This is a really critical point in the whole debate. In April 2022, a new rule came in that fundamentally changed how long FFLs have to keep their records.
Changed how?
Previously, dealers could generally destroy most of these records after 20 years.
Okay.
The new rule mandates that FFLs must now keep those key records for the entire time they're in business or licensed.
Indefinitely while they're active.
Essentially, yes. And then, when they cease operations, they're required to transfer these records to the ATF, all of them.
That's a huge change from destroying them after 20 years. What was the ATF's reason for this?
The ATF stated that the old practice, destroying records after 20 years, was creating a significant and growing problem for tracing firearms used in crimes.
Because the records just weren't there anymore.
Exactly. They reported that, on average, over 1,300 firearms each year became untraceable simply because the records had been legally destroyed. The new rule also says records of transactions that didn't result in a transfer, like a denial, have to be kept separately. And while paper forms older than 20 years can be stored off-site, that off-site location is still considered part of the dealer's premises and subject to ATF inspection.
So a move towards much longer retention, mandatory transfer of all records to the ATF when a dealer closes. Now, there was also mention of an amendment just this year, 2024, aiming to defund what some are calling the ATF's digital gun registry. What was that about?
Right. On July 9th, 2024, Congressman Andrew Clyde introduced an amendment during a committee markup session in the House.
Oh.
This amendment specifically sought to cut off funding for ATF activities related to establishing what the amendment called a digital gun registry.
And how did that go over?
It sparked a significant debate. Supporters argued the ATF's digitization practices, especially retaining and centralizing these records, violated the Firearm Owners Protection Act, or FOPA, the part that bans a national gun registry.
And the opponents.
They stressed how vital these records are for law enforcement, for tracing guns, solving crimes. In the end, the amendment passed the committee, 29-25.
Passed the committee.
Yeah, and it's now part of the House Appropriations bill, but, it still has a long way to go. Full House, Senate, President's signature, so its ultimate fate, its actual impact, still uncertain.
That sounds like a direct political challenge to the ATF's digitization, squarely based on those registry concerns. And then there's also this new rule about who is engaged in the business of selling firearms. How does that fit in?
That's definitely relevant, too. This new rule, signed in April 2024, comes out of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Okay.
It basically broadens the legal definition of who's considered engaged in the business of selling firearms, meaning more people selling guns, maybe online, at gun shows. Other ways, if they're doing it predominantly for profit, would now need to get an FFL, get licensed, conduct background checks.
I see.
The rule also tries to clarify what counts as a personal firearms collection, trying to distinguish hobbyists from dealers.
But this new rule, it hasn't exactly sailed through smoothly, has it? There have been legal challenges.
No, definitely not smoothly. A federal district court in Texas first issued a temporary restraining order against it in May 2024.
Stopping enforcement temporarily.
Right. Then in June, a preliminary injunction followed. That prevents the ATF from enforcing the rule against specific groups, residents of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Utah, and members of certain gun rights groups.
And what were the court's issues with the rule?
The court raised several concerns, like the possibility the rule could mean Even a single gun sale might be enough to qualify as engaged in the business, even without actual profit. The court also worried the rule might arbitrarily eviscerate the safe harbor for personal collections, basically forcing gun owners to prove they're not dealers.
Shifting the burden of proof.
Potentially, yeah. Plus, there are efforts in Congress, joint resolutions, aiming to just block this rule entirely.
So it's clear there are a lot of interconnected, actively contested developments here. Regulations, legal frameworks.
Yeah.
It's all very much in motion.
Absolutely.
Now, our source material really dives into the federal framework, the specific laws against a national gun registry. FOPA, the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, seems like the cornerstone here.
It absolutely is. FOPA explicitly prohibits the establishment of a national gun registry.
What does it actually say?
The law, Title 18 U.S. Code Section 926A, it's pretty clear. It says no rule or regulation can require that records of firearm sales or dispositions be recorded at or transferred to a government facility.
Okay.
And it prohibits establishing any system for registering firearms owners or transactions. The language seems quite direct.
It does sound very clear-cut. So how does the ATF square this prohibition with their increasing collection and digitization of these out-of-business dealer records? That seems like the central conflict.
It is. The argument often made is this. Before FOPA was passed, ATF regulations going back to 1968 already required out-of-business dealers to send their records to the government.
So it was already happening.
In this view, FOPA actually codified that existing requirement for out-of-business dealers. It's also interesting, the Senate version of FOPA initially had even stricter language. It would have limited centralized storage, computerization of these records, but that specific language was dropped.
Interesting.
Plus, a 1996 GAO report specifically looked at the ATF's microfilm system back then and concluded it did not violate FOPA.
So the distinction they draw is?
The distinction is often that the current system, even with digitization, isn't a searchable registry of gun owners, primarily because of that legal restriction preventing searches by purchaser name in OBRES.
Okay, so the argument hinges on that searchable by name limitation and the fact that collecting out-of-business records predates FOPA. What about the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993? Does that add anything else?
The Brady Act, mostly known for creating NICS, the background check system.
Right, yeah.
It also includes specific provisions to stop NICS itself from becoming a national registry.
How so?
Section 922 mandates the Attorney General must ensure NICS doesn't operate as a registry of firearms owners or transactions. It even requires destroying records related to approved transfers after the check is done.
Destroying the records for approved purchases.
Yes, and a 2024 Congressional Research Service report confirms this, noting the ban on using NICS records to create any gun registry except for records on prohibited persons.
So the Brady Act reinforces that background check system shouldn't become a registry, even mandating record destruction. And then our source material mentions these Consolidated Appropriations Acts. What's their role?
Yes, the power of the purse. For many years, Congress has consistently put specific language into these annual funding bills to explicitly block federal funds from being used to create a national gun registry.
Year after year.
Pretty much. Our source material highlights a 34-year stretch, fiscal 79 through 2012, where these acts blocked rules that would require FFLs to submit, say, quarterly sales reports.
Preventing that kind of regular reporting from active dealers.
Exactly. And interestingly, the language in the FY 2012 Act included the word hereafter, suggesting maybe a more permanent ban on those kinds of reporting rules.
And didn't the GAO find the ATF had actually violated these funding restrictions before?
Yes, that 2016 GAO report we mentioned earlier, it found the ATF had previously violated these restrictions with its A2K and FRNP systems because of how they collected and kept data.
Okay, so consistent efforts by Congress through specific laws like FOPA and Brady, and through funding restrictions to prevent a federal gun registry. This brings us to a really basic question. What exactly is a gun registry? What does it look like in practice?
That's crucial for understanding this whole debate, right?
Yeah.
At its core, a gun registry is a government-run system that tracks firearm ownership in a specific area.
But they vary a lot.
Hugely. Some might be comprehensive national databases, every gun, every owner. Others might be state or local, maybe only covering certain types of firearms like handguns or assault weapons.
And the arguments for and against.
Proponents say they're valuable for law enforcement tracing crime guns, fighting trafficking. Opponents, as we've discussed, worry about privacy and the potential risk that registries could lead to confiscation down the road.
Is there evidence they actually work to reduce violence?
Interestingly, a 2023 RAND Corporation review looked at this and found the evidence on the effectiveness of registration requirements is still inconclusive. Not clear-cut either way. There's even some newer research looking at encrypted registry systems, trying to find a balance between law enforcement needs and privacy.
And we see a real mix of these registries here in the U.S. at the state level and also internationally, right?
Absolutely. Here in the U.S., 6 states, California, Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Michigan, plus D.C., have some form of firearm registration.
And they differ.
Oh, yeah. California's is very comprehensive. Hawaii requires registration of all firearms. New York registers handguns and assault weapons. New Jersey, just handguns. Maryland, certain regulated firearms. Michigan, handguns. And D.C. requires registration of all firearms and even adds things like fingerprinting and photos.
Wow, quite the range. And internationally, are national registries more common?
Yes, much more common. Many countries have them. Our sources point to Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK as having pretty detailed national systems.
Okay.
And others like Brazil, China, India, Mexico, South Africa have some form of registration too, though the details vary a lot.
So if we look at these state and international examples, what are the typical features, the characteristics that really define a gun registry?
Good question. Based on those examples, a registry usually involves a few key things. 1, a centralized database consolidating ownership and transaction info.
All in one place.
Right. 2, detailed information, both about the owner, personal details, and the specific firearm make, model, serial number.
Very specific data.
3, transaction records and history. Who bought it, who sold it, when, where, tracking the ownership over time. And this tracking of transaction history is particularly relevant when you think about the ATF digitizing all those 4473s.
It really brings that into focus.
Definitely. 4, there are usually legal compliance rules, requirements to register, penalties if you don't, maybe some exemptions. And 5, sometimes additional verification, like the fingerprints and photos we saw in D.C.
It certainly puts the ATF's increasing digitization efforts into a sharper perspective when you lay out those characteristics. Okay, let's get right to the core arguments now. For and against the ATF's digitization of these Form 4473s, specifically from the out-of-business dealers. What are the ATF's main justifications?
Okay, the ATF's arguments, pulling from our sources and related court cases, likely focus on a few key areas. First, regulatory compliance. They'd argue digitization helps FFLs meet record-keeping laws, which courts have said are important.
Making it easier to follow the rules.
Right. Second, efficiency and accuracy. Digitization improves error detection, makes retrieval faster for inspections or investigations. Again, courts have found temporary electronic retention for audits reasonable in the past.
Faster access for tracing.
Exactly. Which leads to the third point, public safety and law enforcement. Enabling faster, more effective firearm tracing for criminal investigations. Courts have recognized the need for regulatory inspections to prevent crime.
Okay.
And finally, they'd strongly argued this is not creating a national registry. They'd say digitizing records held by individual FFLs, even after they close, isn't the same as a centralized, searchable database of owners, especially with that restriction on searching by name. They'd point back to rulings saying temporary audit logs aren't a registry.
Okay, those are the arguments for digitization. Now, what are the main counterarguments, the concerns from those who oppose these efforts?
The opposition raises several significant points. The big one, the primary argument, is that this prolonged retention and digitization, especially of all these out-of-business records, effectively creates a de facto national gun registry.
Even if it's not searchable by name right now.
Yes. They argue it gets around the clear ban in FOPA, Section 926A, by just collecting this massive database of transactions. They might point to older cases highlighting sensitivity around registration and self-incrimination issues.
Okay, what else?
Second, Fourth Amendment concerns. Unreasonable search and seizure. The idea that indefinite retention and digitization infringes on reasonable expectations of privacy, drawing on principles from cases about privacy in the digital age.
Privacy concerns. Makes sense.
Third, administrative overreach, the non-delegation doctrine argument. Basically saying the ATF is expanding requirements beyond what Congress clearly authorized without a clear guiding principle from the legislature.
Exceeding their authority.
That's the claim. And finally, a really significant concern is the potential chilling effect on Second Amendment rights.
Oh.
The fear that widespread government surveillance of gun ownership, the potential for future misuse of this data, could deter law-abiding citizens from exercising their right to own firearms in the first place. They draw parallels to First Amendment cases where potential chilling effects were key.
So it really boils down to a fundamental disagreement, doesn't it? How to interpret existing laws like FOPA in the face of new technology.
Exactly.
A clash between the perceived needs for regulation and law enforcement versus these deeply held concerns about privacy and the right to bear arms in the digital age.
Precisely. The core tension lies right there. What is a registry in this modern context? How do old laws apply to new tech? And what are the long-term consequences of digitizing all this firearm record data for public safety and individual liberties?
And as we've seen with the Clyde Amendment, the court challenges to the engaged in business rule. This is a debate that is very much still playing out.
Absolutely. The legal landscape, the political landscape around this, it's dynamic, it's still evolving. Things are definitely not settled.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's maybe a final point for you, the listener, to consider. Given the sheer volume of these records, almost 1 billion, and the power of digital technology, how do you see this delicate balance being struck between regulatory needs and protecting individual rights in the years ahead? What do you see as the potential long-term implications for public safety, for personal freedoms? It's certainly complex, no easy answers here. And definitely warrants continued thought, maybe even digging into some of those primary legal sources we touched on today.